Well, there had almost been 2 stonings that day. First, there was the woman caught in adultery who was brought to the temple by the scribes and Pharisees, and they stood her in front of Jesus. You see, they were testing him, but Jesus would have none of it. He said, "Let anyone among you who is without sin throw the first stone at her." And well, one by one, they walked away. Jesus said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." And he continued teaching in front of the temple, telling the crowds that he is the light of the world and that the truth will set them free. Once again, the Pharisees took issue with what Jesus was teaching, and in the end, they threatened to stone him. Chapter 8 of John's Gospel ends, "So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple." There were almost 2 stonings that day and a lot to talk about, and a lot of talk about sin. So it is no wonder that as Jesus and the disciples were walking along later that day, when Jesus saw a man who had been blind from birth, the disciples asked, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Now, this question sounds somewhat ill-informed, doesn't it? But in that time, there were generally 2 reasons a person had an illness or a disability. Their parents sinned or they sinned. And lest we think that this way of thinking is reserved just for biblical times, I know parents who have had children born with a disability or contract a disease, and often the parents ask themselves what they did to cause this to happen to their child. And sometimes other people even ask them that same question. But the good news here is that Jesus says in this passage unequivocally, neither this man nor his parents sinned. In other words, illness and disabilities, they don't work like that. People don't bring them on themselves or their children. Who sinned? The disciples asked. And actually, if they would have stopped the question right there, it would have been actually a good question. They might have asked the right question. But they went on to ask if it was this man or his parents. That was the wrong question. See, commentators Gail O'Day and Susan Hyland write that in the 4th gospel, in John's gospel, sin is not a moral category about behavior, but a theological category about one's response to the revelation of God in Jesus. This means that whether a person is sinning depends upon their reaction to Jesus. It depends upon whether they try to get closer to him, to have a relationship with him, or try to distance themselves from him. And as we get further into this story, we would be well served to ask the question, who sinned? So Jesus and the disciples came upon this man who was blind. They came upon him because most likely he was actually sitting on the side of the road begging. It was really the only way a person who was blind could eke out a living, by relying on the kindness of strangers. And even though his parents lived in the village, he still had to beg to survive. Maybe if we ask the question, who sinned here, we might think about the kind of society that would allow for this kind of cruelty to those who are most vulnerable in their community. Could they not have treated him with more respect and more dignity, with the kind of care and support that would have allowed him to live a life without begging for every scrap he would receive? You know, one cannot help but hear the words of Jesus from Matthew's gospel, right? When you did it to the least of these who are my brothers and sisters, you did it to me. Or when you did not do it to the least of these who are my brothers and sisters, you did not do it to me. Who sinned? So with this blind man in front of him, Jesus spat on the ground and made mud with his spittle and put the mud on the man's eyes. Notice a couple things here. The man did not ask Jesus to heal him, did he? Jesus saw him. Jesus went to him, and Jesus healed him. And after spreading the mud on the man's eyes, Jesus said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then the man went and washed, and he came back able to see. Remember last week when Nicodemus was talking with Jesus? And Jesus said, "You must be born of water and the Spirit," and Nicodemus could not wrap his mind around what Jesus was saying about being born from above or being born again. This is what Jesus meant. In the healing of the man born blind, we have a story of new life. Just as God formed humankind out of the clay of the earth and breathed life into it in the book of Genesis, so Jesus took the clay of the earth and gave sight to a man who was blind. And he told him to go wash in the pool. Like the waters of baptism, the man washed in the pool, a pool where people purified themselves for festivals at the temple. The man washed in the living water and was given back his life. Or maybe even more appropriately, was sent back, sent out to live his life. He was freed from the limits of being blind, and he was happy to tell anyone who would listen what Jesus had done for him. The problem was, no one recognized him. No one recognized this man who used to beg on the side of the road now that he was no longer blind. He was no longer the man who was blind, and his friends and his neighbors had no idea. People who saw him every day had no idea who he was because they could no longer identify him by his limits. And it makes me wonder how many times I only identify people by what their limits are, by what they cannot do. So the man who was born blind was not recognized by his neighbors. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" And some were saying, "It is he," and others were saying, "No, but it looks like him, somebody like him." He kept saying, "I am the man, I am the man." But they kept asking him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" Really, they were asking, could this really happen? It's unbelievable. How can we believe this? And to all this, I ask, who sinned? Then the Pharisees get in on the action, don't they, right? Notice that Jesus has left the building at this point in the story, and the neighbors brought the Pharisees to the man, and the Pharisees grill him about what happened. And it seems they're confounded because Jesus healed the man on the Sabbath, which was against the Jewish law to do any work on the Sabbath, and they considered healing to be work. Now, some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." Now remember, they were already out to get Jesus, right? They're already testing him in the previous chapter. So they're just looking for another excuse, another way to entrap him. So some Pharisees are saying, "This man is a sinner." But others say, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. As a friend of mine said recently, Sabbath keeping and mercy go hand in hand. They go hand in hand. It's something the Pharisees in this story could learn. Now, author Flannery O'Connor puts it this way: all human nature vigorously resists grace because grace changes us and the change is painful. I think that's kind of what's happening here. This grace, this change, it must have been painful for the Pharisees because they kept asking the man over and over what happened. And the man kept telling them, but they didn't believe him. I mean, they thought he was lying altogether about being blind. So they tracked down his parents and brought his parents in to testify. "Is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" And his parents say, "We know that this is our son. And we know that he was born blind, but we don't know how it is that he now sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself." Now, his parents don't really stick up for their son, do they? Because they are terrified. They are afraid that the Pharisees will kick them out of the synagogue. Maybe they're afraid that they'll kick their son out of the synagogue too, right? They knew that anyone who confessed Jesus as the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. So to save their own skin and maybe their son's skin, they evade answering the Pharisees' question. Now the irony here is what happens at the end, right? The son gets driven out of the synagogue, right? It happens anyway. So the encounter between the man and the Pharisees goes like this. It continues on. The man gives his testimony. He knows the truth that will set one free, and he tells the truth. "I don't know whether Jesus is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" And he answered them, "I've told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" That made the Pharisees angry. They reviled him. They reviled him, it says. "You are his disciple," they said. We are disciples of Moses." The Pharisees did not want to know the truth. They did not want to accept the fact that grace changes a person. In this case, the person was changed physically and spiritually. And then they drove him out of the synagogue. And I wonder still, who sinned? Then Jesus comes back on the scene once again. Who knows where he and the disciples went, but when he comes back, he goes and finds the man who was blind again, a second time. And he asks, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And the man answered, "Who is he, sir? Tell me, so that I may believe in him." And Jesus says, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." And the man says, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Now the man who was once blind foreshadows the words that Jesus will speak very soon in chapter 10 of John's Gospel, where Jesus talks about being the good shepherd, and that he came that those people, all people, might have life and have it abundantly. The man who was once blind, sitting on the side of the road, day by day, begging just to exist, now is embracing the abundant life that Jesus offers to all. And then the entire story ends by Jesus saying, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." Pharisees were listening in on this conversation, weren't they? Because they say, "Surely we're not blind, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say we see, your sin remains." Once again, commentators O'Day and Hyland write, sight and blindness in this gospel are not defined by one's physical sight, but by one's openness to the revelation of God in Jesus. In other words, it's defined by if you know who Jesus is. So while a blind man is healed of his blindness in this story, which is a pretty compelling story in itself, what the gospel writer wants us to be aware of is that, like sin, blindness is about how we relate, or more precisely, choose not to relate to Jesus. Yes, the man who was born blind, he could not see, but more than that, he gained a way that leads to seeing that leads to life, abundant life in Jesus Christ. So that gets us back to the original question, who sinned? If we remember in John's gospel, sin is about one's response to the revelation of God in Jesus. Then those who did not see Jesus as the Son of Man, but as a sinner himself, they've sinned. Those who did not believe in him and worship him have sinned. So that leaves the neighbors, the Pharisees, even the man's parents. I'd like to think that just as Jesus came to the man who was born blind and sought him out, just as Jesus put mud on the eyes of the man who has no name in this story, just as Jesus told to go him and wash with the water of life, that Jesus comes to every one of us. Jesus seeks us out, healing that which prevents us from seeing him, and in doing so, offers the abundant life. He offers it so that each one of us may come to say, I was blind, but now I see. Amen.